So one of the questions that were asked by you in class were, what are our sources for ancient Greek philosophy? So let us do a short aside to look at what kind of sources, and this is actually a pretty important question, because unlike sort of working on more contemporary sort of philosophy, or even on philosophy, from 15th, 16th century onwards, though of course, there is a canon and then there are a lot of other things that are lost. The problem with, the early Greek philosophy and the text that we are actually looking at is that we do not have accurate, complete texts for anybody, right? Anybody, absolutely. So all the thinkers that we're looking at, we're going to have, fragments from here and there, some testimonia, from other philosophers who have written about them. So our sources are not exactly perfect. In fact, the earliest source, I would say, earliest proper source in some ways is Plato, and he's not a proper source. I mean, there are mentions amongst sort of, comedy writers, or amongst the playwrights, Euripides or Aristophanes, of these philosophers, but nothing systematic. So Plato is the first one to have mentioned them as, precursors. So he does mention, for example, you have a text by Plato on Parmenides. But the problem is that Plato cannot be a perfect source, and no philosopher can be a perfect source for another philosopher, I feel, because Plato especially, but all philosophers generally have their own philosophical system that they are in the process of developing. And so anybody that they talk about, it's always a kind of partial, in the sense of it's the explanation that Plato would give, for example, of any philosopher would be how well he would fit into the system, or how much he likes him or how much he doesn't like him. So it's not a, like, let's say, an objective, if such a thing can even exist, an objective sort of reporting of earlier philosophers. Aristotle did try that a bit more than Plato, but even he had the problem of, for example, in Metaphysics Alpha, where the whole section is on pre-Socratic philosophers. Whenever he talks about any particular philosopher, it's always about whether they sort of give the four causes, and now the four causes are something that Aristotle is developing, right? So he is looking for all explanation in terms of these four causes, in terms of material cause and efficient cause and final cause, and what was the fourth one? Formal cause. Right? So he is the one who is looking for explanation in terms of these four causes. And so he then criticizes people like, the Milesians, for example. He would say that, oh, they only have a material cause, but they don't have an efficient cause or a formal cause or whatever. And this is, first of all, not fair to the Milesians, because, when even looking at the very minimal fragments we have, we cannot rule out that they don't have, these other causes in the way Aristotle means it. Second, then what we are doing is we are trying to understand these early philosophers via Aristotle's lenses, which are just Aristotle's lenses, so it would give us a better explanation of actually Aristotle's philosophy than of these philosophers. So there is a good and a bad to these early philosophical texts by Aristotle and Plato, where they mention the pre-Socratics. The good is that then we have more fragments, and we can hope that they quoted them correctly, though I think that at least Plato definitely had a habit of quoting from memory. So there is a problem. There's a danger, that philosophers are quoting from memory, so that would not be perfect. But we can, there are a lot of scholars who do work on reconstructing these texts and seeing whether, how accurate they are. With philosophers who have written in verse, for example, with Parmenides, they have a better sort of chance of doing that, because then they can see whether it fits into the hexameter or not, and then which words would be better placed there and which words not. But with some of them, you can just hope that the early sort of, commentators quoted them correctly. So you have Plato, as I said, not a perfect source, but a source, so good for us. Then you have Aristotle, who is a better source than Plato, because he at least did try to do a history of philosophy, but again, from his perspective. But, where he quotes, we can hope that he does quote them sort of as accurately as he could at that time. And then you have Theophrastus, who tried to write a history of philosophy from Thales to Plato. Now the issue again is that all these sources are pretty far removed, even though they are all ancient sources, they're still pretty far removed from, the original. And in a lack of like a written text, we don't know. So that's one of the problems. The second problem is that, when we have just fragments and bits and pieces that come from, then a lot of fragments were actually probably lost. A lot of texts were actually lost. So why do we have so much from Plato and Aristotle and from Democritus, who was a contemporary in some ways? He was a contemporary of Plato. Why do we not have that much? Was because a lot of these texts were basically preserved by medieval scholars who, at that time, before printing, would copy and write them out. Now, they did make a choice of which text to copy and which text to not copy. Right? So a lot of it would have been destroyed simply because people did not want to copy them, and as you will see in the course of this course, that there were some philosophers that were preferred. So Aristotle was preferred above all for various reasons, good and bad, in the sense that, some of it was based on Aristotle, a misunderstanding of Aristotle, and some of it because Aristotle did provide a very good sort of, philosophical system which could, with those specific misunderstandings, sit well with the sort of religious system that they wanted to promote. So certain philosophers, for that reason, were then excluded because they did not fit into the religious sort of, dogmatic system of the world that they desired to create. So a lot was lost because of that as well. Then some things were lost because of, the burning of the Library of Alexandria. Then there was some things lost because of, I think, a volcanic eruption of Mount Etna, and which buried a library where I think they had a lot of Epicurean texts, which is after Aristotle even, but still, a lot was lost because of that. And so we don't know. I mean, the problem is that from 6th century BC to now, not much has traveled over. But what is great about this is that even with like just a very few texts, just some fragments, how much we can sort of get out of them. Like the amount of discussion we can have, how rich they are, how much they sort of, like they speak to us. In fact, you will see in the course of this sort of like this course actually that just a couple of fragments from Anaximander, and we could spend days discussing them. It's actually wonderful. It's sort of, you have these hints and you have these little fragments, really tantalizing fragments, and then we can spend, we can write a whole book. I think people have written whole books. Heidegger at least has a very long sort of text on Anaximander, on Greek philosophy generally. And then we mentioned Carlo Rovelli, who has, Anaximander, the first scientist. So what I'm saying is that even with like a very, irritating in some ways lack of original sources, and it is irritating because once you get into it, you're like, I want to know more. I want to know what exactly he might have meant, and maybe he had said something else. But we still, whatever we have, we can do a lot with it. So that's, what I wanted to say about sources, that we may not have, complete texts, but with the fragments that we have, and sometimes we have a lot. Like, for example, with Parmenides, we'll be looking at the whole poem. And we have more than 50 lines, actually more than 60, 70 lines probably. I'll have to check the number. But, we have a lot from Parmenides, and that it is still fairly difficult to understand what's going on. In fact, one of the most difficult texts is Parmenides. And then we have a variety of fragments from Heraclitus, and there are different ways of understanding him and different ways of reconstructing, of putting them together. And a lot of people actually basically spend their whole academic careers, putting the fragments in different orders and trying to come up with like an explanation of things. But as you will see that even with these very few sources, there's a lot that we can actually do. So yeah, that's what I wanted to say about sources, and I hope this answered some of your questions. And yeah, if you have more, please do write on Classroom. So yeah, thank you.